Hello, and welcome to the Bitcoin Roundup podcast presented by Coinbits. We bring Bitcoin news, hot topics of conversation, and deep dives into a variety of Bitcoin topics to you weekly. We are Coinbits, a Bitcoin financial services company. Check us out at coinbits.app. This recording is for informational purposes only. No investment or legal or any other advice should be drawn from this content. And as always, consult an advisor before making any legal or financial decisions.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Bitcoin Roundup Live, hosted by Coinbits. Today, we are very honored to have the Bitcoin royal family, as Saifedean likes to call them. I think that term is Pierre and Morgen. Pierre and Morgen Rochard. Morgen, Pierre, welcome. Thank you for being so gracious to us with your time. I'm glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm hesitant any kind of royalty titles, given that we now have actual royalty in Bitcoin with Prince Philip from Europe.
Yep, that's fair. Yeah, we're definitely not a royal family, regular plebe family.
Well, we're glad to have you away. Now, of course, the Rochards need no introduction, but in case you're near, and Rochards, please forgive me, there's no easy way to capture all of your proof of work in any kind of short intro, but here's my humble attempt at it. Pierre is currently the VP of Research at Riot Blockchain, a Bitcoin mining company. This comes after he spent a good chunk of time directing Bitcoin products for Kraken, and one of the major accomplishments that he had there is launching Lightning support there, and thereby trolling every other Bitcoin exchange for not having Lightning support yet. So thank you for that, Pierre. He's also the co-founder of the Nakamoto Institute. Check them out at nakamotoinstitute.org, where you can find some amazing foresight in his writing and understanding of Bitcoin, which to this day, I mean, some of these things go back to 2013, 2014. It's incredible to see the foresight that's out there. Morgen is the owner of Origin Wizards, a financial planning firm which specializes in helping families find freedom and pass it on to the next generation. Prior to founding Origin, Morgen managed portfolios at UBS and also worked at Merrill Lynch. And Morgen is also an author of a fantastic book, which you should check out. And also, Morgen is a financial advisor. And even though she's not necessarily your financial advisor, and neither are we at Coinbits. So Coinbits is a Bitcoin-only financial services company. So check us out, coinbits.app. And therefore, nothing discussed in this conversation constitutes investment, legal, tax, or other advice. We are not your advisors. So this is for informational purposes only. And before making any decisions, please be sure to consult an advisor. If your advisor is for some reason not telling you to own Bitcoin, what are you doing? You should fire that person. Check out Origin. Check out more. Again, not advice, informational purposes only. So again, thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm really glad that you're here and excited to have this conversation. And so we wanted to focus this conversation primarily on kind of family life. I mean, you guys have spoken a bunch this week, and we don't want to have you repeat some of the information you already provided. But yeah, I would be remiss, I think, if we don't ask you about kind of the major news topic of the day, which is the White House latest babbling about Bitcoin and digital assets, etc. So I'll frame it this way, and you guys take this wherever you'd like. Do you think that I mean, we've all anticipated, and we see the likely fight that's coming towards Bitcoin, and there are varied opinions on this, but do you think that in the US that will actually have a CBDC come to fruition in any kind of sort of meaningful way? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would first start with what we agree on with the White House. So I agree with the White House that we do want to improve Bitcoin's user experience so that it is inclusive and everybody can use Bitcoin very easily. And that way we can accelerate Bitcoin adoption. I think that was a major point that they made, which is exciting to see. I agree with them that coin should be part of US national policy in the sense that every government in the world, whether it's state, local, or federal, is going to need to adopt Bitcoin. So they need to understand how to properly secure their own private keys, how to build up a reserve of Bitcoin and do it in a responsible manner that doesn't result in them losing Bitcoin. And that they really they want to do more research around. So in particular, I would direct their attention to doing research on how to do a multi-sig that would allow all the leaders to have the power of the purse so that they could have a, 400, probably like 200 of 400 multisig using MUSIG 2. So I think that they should direct the NSA and other agencies that have cryptographic capabilities to be reviewing the MUSIG 2 proposal and improving on it and making it, very secure. That way we can have a really great multisig, because it's really important for legislators to take more from the executive branch. I think that's a major bipartisan view. So there's a lot we agree on. Something that there does seem to be a difference on is whether it's good to use proof of work or not. I think that there's just a lot of misunderstanding out there whereby some people think that proof of work is not necessary. They think that there are credible alternatives to using proof of work. And if we listen to the computer scientists, the experts on the matter, it's pretty clear that there is no alternative to proof of work if your goal is to have a decentralized system that empowers its users. So if this is really about financial inclusion, which I think it is, there is no alternative to proof of work. Proof of stake is the opposite in terms of financial inclusion. So it's about creating a new set of insiders who can exploit people, which is a really negative outcome. And proof of stake is not decentralized. It does not solve the double spending problem. It is broken on its own. But however, it is possible to anchor proof of stake in proof of work. So we saw two researchers came out with a really interesting paper titled Pikachu, which allows you to use Taproot to checkpoint your proof of stake system within Bitcoin's blockchain. So I think that the White House and the federal government should encourage altcoiners, or, whatever we want to call them, these proof of stake folks, to better secure their networks and their blockchains by using Bitcoin's technology. Furthermore, we see that Bitcoin already has proof of stake, or something that we could consider to be proof of stake, which is the Lightning Network, which really, if we talk about energy efficiency, Lightning is the most energy efficient payments network in the history of humanity. And so it's really exciting that it's being built on top of Bitcoin. I think that, the White House would agree with us that Lightning is going to be the future of payments throughout the world, and that all payments will occur on Lightning, and we'll just use the base layer blockchain for final settlement or cold storage. So I think that, Treasury should be running a Lightning node and contributing liquidity to the Lightning network. That would be a really constructive, and that would help them learn more about the future and the present, really, because at the end of the day, Lightning does work today. I think that what something they missed when they talked about the current size of Bitcoin is that on-chain Bitcoin transactions settled $50 trillion worth of Bitcoin over the past 12 months. So this is a network. It's not an experiment, right? This is an established final settlement network that is global and operating 24/7 and is, being settling material amounts of value, even compared to the traditional financial system. So they need to understand that it's not early days anymore, in a sense, and they have a lot of catching up to do. The Federal Reserve is not integrated with the Bitcoin network, which is just astonishing in the year 2022. So they just need to figure out how to, integrate their systems, how to run a Bitcoin node, and how to offer Bitcoin, BTC, custodial BTC granted, but BTC nonetheless, in all kinds of commercial bank accounts, right? You should be able to deposit and withdraw Bitcoin from Chase or from Wells Fargo. This is like long overdue, and people are having to rely on other solutions. So, there's just a lot of work to be done, and it seems like there is some interest in catching up. But in other regards, they just seem very confused about what the value of the technology is, particularly when they start talking about CBDC, right? CBDC is the preferred technology of the Chinese Communist Party, because it is a totalitarian technology that is focused on, really politically operating the entire economy and controlling people down to the minute details of their day-to-day expenses. And so it's deeply un-American, and it was shocking to see them suggest otherwise. I think that the statement should have been, vigorously condemning CBDC and denouncing the Chinese Communist Party for creating a financial panopticon. It's dystopian, and they just have no place in American politics. I don't think that it's an acceptable view to say that, CBDCs are good technology or anything like that. So hopefully, as they study CBDCs, they'll come to realize that this is not something that is good for consumers, certainly not in the national interest, and that really what we need to be focused on is how to promote Bitcoin adoption here in the US, but also abroad, right? We need to help dissidents in oppressed countries, including in communist China. We need to help them circumvent kind of the totalitarian anti-democracy elements in their society. So, China banned Bitcoin mining, China banned Bitcoin trading because they do not want to empower their citizens. Right. They want to disempower them. They want to run really kind of a feudal society. And that's just not acceptable in kind of our modern context. So yeah, that was my reaction to what came out of the White House. Maybe Morgan has more to add.
Yeah, I agree 100% on everything that you just said, and I would emphasize the specifics about it not being good for consumers. It's also not good for savers. If the history of the US dollar has told us anything, then we know just by the properties that they will probably do to CBDCs what they're currently doing to our money. In which case, like the average saver is no better off on the CBDC system. And in fact, they're worse off, right? Because not only do they have no privacy, but they're also getting diluted.
That's right. And something else that has come up as a criticism of CBDC, which is really interesting, is that if they were to cut out the entire banking system and kind of all of the private payment systems, right? So basically replacing everything from Visa to Amex to all of the commercial banks, all the chunks, and turn all of that into essentially one monolith of the Federal Reserve run CBDC, it would be a total monopoly on the entire payment system and monetary system. And so I think that that's just contrary to generally a market-based economy where competition between entrepreneurs get the best results for consumers. And it also is at odds with the Biden administration's focus on breaking up monopolies, especially tech monopolies and other, large economic entities. And so creating the world's biggest monopoly, which would be a Federal Reserve CBDC, would have disastrous results for competition. And so it's really, I think that it's interesting because I think the banking system is going to agree with Bitcoiners on this, that they don't want to have to be nationalized, right? They don't want a communist payment system in the US. It would be disastrous for savers, as Morgan mentioned, and for everyday users of payment systems.
Hey, Pierre, this is Dave with Coinbits. I have a question about that. So, and I'm no expert in CBDCs, but my understanding is that there is a way of, there's kind of two different models. There's the retail money model, and then there's also kind of the wholesale model. So CBDCs for banks, we retain the private banking system. Really only banks that interact with the CBDC, and the way that consumers interact with banks is sort of changed. Is that like a distinction without a difference in your view? Is that something where we might see like one and then the other later? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's a fair distinction. I think, though, that if we look at what's going on in the kind of at the wholesale level or at the Federal Reserve level between banks, they already have a CBDC, right? It's called the US dollar. It's already digital, and it's already, they have FedWire, and that's how they move money around. And now, as the White House report pointed out, they also have a new system called FedNow, which is instant payments. And so adding CBDC to this would just be a waste of money, right? So if the government wants to waste resources, then a new CBDC system that is shadowing the existing and that, is improving already, right? They're now instant. I think that would be a huge waste of resources, huge waste of taxpayer money, and completely unjustifiable because they it wouldn't get any more adoption than the current system. So I think that is just a nonsensical kind of compromise position that has been put out there. But the real position that they have, or that some policymakers have, is that they want everyone to only use the government payment system, right? They don't want you to use Visa or your bank or anyone else. They want you to all use the government's payment system so that the government can control your life, and so that they can extract all of your wealth, and whether it's in the form of inflation or taxation, and that if you become unpopular, right, that they can essentially ban you from the economy by removing your access to the CBDC. So this is utterly dystopian. It is unconstitutional, and it's deeply immoral on a human level. I think the people who have this policy view should be kind of shamed, ignored, and marginalized.
Really good perspective there, Pierre. Thank you for sharing that. As you were talking about in the beginning, it's hard to imagine that there's any meaningful amount of people in the U.S. government at any level that would have been able to, even identify maybe, even 50% of what you're talking about with running nodes and getting on the Lightning Network and all of that. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops over time. But it's Friday afternoon, and we want to send people off into the weekend with kind of a relaxed conversation. And the initial intention of this conversation was to talk about Bitcoin and family, and it's a less serious conversation that we hope to kind of get into now with this chat. So thank you for sharing your thoughts, and I think let's pivot a little bit back here to happier topics like family life. So I'll start off by asking Morgan. Actually, Morgan, you're a much more measured person, and it's definitely, you could definitely hear it in Pierre's voice and changes over the years, and you're making him more measured. So let me ask you, what's it like being married to a crazy Bitcoin maximalist, a classically trained financial planning professional? What are your thoughts?
I wonder if you should be asking Pierre, what's it like to be married to a crazy orange-filled toxic financial planner? But I mean, in fairness, yeah, Pierre and I have been together almost a decade now, and Pierre was definitely orange-filled before I was. And I like to think that we really balance each other out quite a bit, and that he's pulled me more towards where I need to be, and like being more objective about what the monetary system needs. And I've pulled him more towards where he needs to be as far as how he can best advocate others and savings technology and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I think that home life for sure, it's easier, right, when you're both on the same page. We were always both into Austrian economics, so it wasn't really a big leap for me to go from being into gold to being into Bitcoin. I think it's a lot more difficult, right, when you don't meet your spouse because you found Rothbard to be interesting. If you just meet your spouse randomly, right, and maybe you don't have that shared interest of economics, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to pull them over to the orange side.
Yeah, definitely. You've been on Twitter for quite some time now, and I think there's a group in Twitter that takes, I think, toxic maximalism to an extreme, but the toxic maximalism is a kind of an ambiguous, undefined term. What are your thoughts on kind of toxic maxis as a general term? Is there anything that in the general community here, big C community, it's undefined, that irks you as someone who is kind of a professional financial planner? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot toxic Bitcoiners are really less of the issue. I think more of the issue is the fact that there is actual scamming going on in the cryptocurrency space, and that as quote unquote toxic Bitcoiners, we are constantly pointing these things out and then being blamed for being toxic. And I've experienced that directly where not, I don't go around calling people clowns and so forth. That's just not part of my persona. But I have seen things to explain things on Twitter to make it obvious to people why they should be Bitcoin only to, have others turn around to me and say that maybe I should, better craft how I say things, or be a little bit more inclusive to include those who are doing other things in the cryptocurrency space. And frankly, I don't think that that's correct. I mean, I think we've seen it over and over again, especially for given how long Pierre and I have been around in the space. We've seen it over and over again, new coins coming in and out, basically people wasting their money on these things, hoping that it's going to be something like Bitcoin, but it's not. And ultimately, you can't create another Bitcoin. And so I think that like the honey badgers are there for a reason, and that each individual person can decide how they want to portray themselves and how they want to interact on Twitter. And ultimately, putting forth a good message about why Bitcoin is the best and why Bitcoin is good is the right way to do it. But everyone's got their own style.
Yeah, I agree with what Morgan just said. And I also, different styles are going to appeal to different people. So some people they like having the good cop, right? And I would say that the good cop is probably Jack Dorsey, right? Other people, they need the bad cop, which is probably IE, who's the baddest cop. He's the one who's pistol whipping you in the interrogation room. And so it's just going to be, different approaches needed for different folks. And so I'm glad that Bitcoin has the full spectrum of, toxicity, from non-toxic to very toxic.
Very well said. Pierre, for those of us here who are orange pilled, kind of far down the rabbit hole, who may be perhaps married, who may have significant others of any kind, but they haven't yet successfully orange pilled, or maybe they're afraid to begin the conversation of orange pilling their significant other. You guys have kind of the unique situation. I think most people are probably not where you guys are, and that you were both kind of, sound money advocates before finding Bitcoin, which I think is unique. But for those of us who may not be there, who may have a significant other who is not a sound money person, what strategies do you suggest for you to use your words, to wear down your significant other into taking the orange pill?
Yeah, I'll let Morgan answer first.
I don't think that it's your job as a spouse to wear down your spouse. I mean, maybe that's not what you meant with your language, but we're here a team. And I go through this with clients all the time, where we generally deal with couple, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean, like, we're not always talking about Bitcoin, right? Two spouses can come together and have a disagreement about many aspects of their financial. And your job as a spouse isn't to wear down your other spouse to get what you want, right? That the job of you both together as a team is to figure out how the two of you can make a good decision as one, so that your financial situation is what you want it to be as a combined unit. And so I think it's very easy for Bitcoiners to say, well, I'm right, it's going to be the world reserve currency, therefore I need to wear down my spouse and get my spouse on board. But that's not the right way of looking at it, right? If you're talking at your spouse all the time about Bitcoin, and you are, quote unquote, wearing them down, and you keep coming with facts and figures and so forth about why Bitcoin is the best thing in the world, they're hearing you, right? Because you're not speaking their language. So I would say do less wearing down and do more listening. What is it that your spouse needs so that they can get on board? How can your spouse be involved? What does your spouse know about money to begin with, right? Listening to all of your spouse's views on this would be the best way for you to figure out how you two move together as a team.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. And I just empirically, I guess I succeeded at that. So, I understood kind of where Morgan was coming from as a financial planner. And whenever I talked about Bitcoin, I tried to connect it to that, instead of talking about database technology or time chain or things like that. But it really depends on the audience, and you've got to know your audience, whether it's with your spouse or, in a different context.
Spoken like actual counselors. You guys might have a second career if you get bored with financial planning to go into couples counseling. Thanks for your perspectives on that. I'm curious if the rest of the team here on the Coinbits team, if you have any interesting tidbits on how to approach a subject with a significant other if perhaps they're not fully on board. As Morgan was saying, maybe listening is a better approach than trying to force sell coin to them. Anybody on the team have any interesting anecdotes to share? While you guys think it through, my wife is not, I would say, a Bitcoiner. Yeah, well, she's a Bitcoiner in theory, but she hasn't fully swallowed the orange pill. She's not on Twitter, and if she were on Twitter, she wouldn't have laser eyes, put it that way. But I think what Morgan said that really resonates with me is the idea that you have to kind of see, and Pierre, it sounds like you took this approach. You have to really understand where the person that you're trying to sell in general, even if it's not a spouse, is coming from. And if you understand from them what they're looking for and what their needs are, and perhaps their perspective on specific things, you can take the angle that most fits their view and drive it home that way. I think this was shared on Twitter somewhere not too long ago, where basically someone was saying one of the plebs, the most successful approach that they've taken to orange pilling anybody is simply asking them, what do you think is most wrong with the world today? And the biggest problem in the world. And then from there, basically take them, like almost do like a backwards analysis of how money impacts that and how sound money could potentially fix that, and then letting them go down the rabbit hole from that version. I think that combines, I think, the strategies that you guys described.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, the other thing I would add is that risk tolerance is not something to be ignored. I think that we often ignore it in the Bitcoin world because once you're all in on Bitcoin, it's really easy to just say and accept the volatility. But for somebody on the outside, that's not as easy as it is for an orange pilled person to do. And you might not really understand what your spouse's risk tolerance is until you have this kind of a conversation. Like the thing that might be holding them back the most might actually be the volatility. They might be hearing everything else that you're saying, but they literally can't stomach the price. And if case, right, then you actually do have your spouse on board more than you already think. You just haven't listened to the reasons why they're not ready to do it. And maybe it's really more about like adjusting position size and seeing, what percentage of your savings maybe you could put into it rather than the entirety of your savings, and working towards a plan where you're both comfortable and confident in the amount that you're.
Yeah, and I can speak from personal experience, because Morgan, you have a lot of background in finances, and I did not when I came to Bitcoin. And when I found Bitcoin, I had to find how does money work first. And with me, like my husband was probably a Bitcoiner. Well, first he was a shitcoiner, and then he turned into a proper Bitcoiner for probably a year before I was orange pilled. And it was really for me, I didn't understand the difference in between what was going on because I always found it was like gambling, all these other cryptocurrencies before I understood what Bitcoin was about. I was like, this is a big gamble. Like, what the heck? This is no different than the stock market if you really don't know what's going on. And so my big orange pilling moment was actually a distraction in the household. So to the point where, I mean, I can tell you an episode that happened. We have a tradition in our house to have two kids. We all sit at the dinner table without screens or devices. And it happened to be, when Bitcoin was dropping to like 3,000, it's like a little over 2 years ago. That night, my husband was on his phone at the dinner table, and it just made me furious. And so it was this little fuse that broke, but it made me ask more questions. And then from there, he was just like so ready. He's like, okay, we're gonna go on a road trip, and we're gonna listen to Max and Stacy. And he just like subliminally just like showing me stuff, and I kept asking questions, and that really worked on me. But the big drop was, like understanding that money should be limited and that Bitcoin is limited and that it's decentralized, and also like grasping what is wrong with the money in the world today. And I think a lot of people, especially even are raised in a family where like finances are talked about or where it's comfortable talking about finances, like a lot of divorces happen because of financial reasons. It's something where I always like to ease people into, do you understand the concept of money? And let's go slow. And I think that's a big breaking point to like actually becoming a Bitcoin maxi.
Really, really awesome anecdote there, Frida. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think most people probably haven't, at least in the US, haven't really given any consideration to what money is. And so therefore all the dream conversations about how money works and why, eventually you get into the point of why Bitcoin is the best form of money that there is a far stretch. Because if they don't recognize the problem, it's hard to, position to them any kind of solution, especially a solution as quote unquote controversial, at least in the mainstream, as Bitcoin is. So that's a really interesting approach that I can't believe you guys started with Max and Stacy. I don't know if that might be swallowing the orange pill the really hard way, but it worked for you. I'm glad that it did.
Yeah, I don't know if we necessarily started out with Max and Stacy. I figured I'd chime in here because there was a couple of things I didn't 100% agree with. Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't say that I started out with shit coins. My first crypto buy was Bitcoin, but I was using Coinbase, and there were a couple of other coins on there. Litecoin at the time was talking about being silver to Bitcoin being gold. I had recently become a gold bug at that stage and was listening to a lot of people like Jim Rickers and Mike Maloney and all those guys. And somehow, Max and Stacy would do interviews and they'd have some of these people on their shows. So I started listening to Max and Stacy on the Kaiser Report through some of the interviews they were having with some of the other gold bugs that I was following. And I kind of liked his no prisoners approach to calling out the scams and the fraud and gaslighting in the financial services industry. And when I was a financial advisor during 2007 and 2008, during the financial crisis, I saw a lot of stuff that just made my stomach turn, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. And so I left that system always looking for a better way. I knew there had to be something better out there than what was currently going on. But at the time, I didn't have anybody in the technology space that could really introduce me to Bitcoin or that type of technology. So it took a couple of years before I came around to it. But once I did, and once I saw it, and I read the white paper, I was like, oh my gosh, this is something I need. But at the time, we were a family just starting out, just bought a house, a kid on the way, a lot of bills to pay, and didn't have a lot of money to start buying. So, I started doing what Morgan was suggesting, just started really lightly dollar cost averaging in, $10 here, $10 there, $100 here, $100 there. When Bitcoin was $3,000 or $1,800 when we first got into it, to buy 0.01 Bitcoin, didn't cost very much money. So it was easy to dollar cost into it that way. Going up at 0.01 Bitcoin when it's at $69,000 was a little bit more difficult, but it began to create this pattern of consistency with me just kind of set it and forget it. And as the Bitcoin price goes, we in the space, we say during a bull market or during a bear market is where all the work gets done, all the building gets done. And I think on an individual level too, us Bitcoiners, we begin to work on ourselves more during that time too, because we have to constantly justify why we're able to stomach this massive volatility and just really reinforce the underlying fundamentals of Bitcoin and what makes it such a strong, valuable asset to our families and our futures moving forward.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I think it's the gradually then suddenly approach to learning Bitcoin, and then all of a sudden you find yourself with laser eyes on Twitter. It's really interesting. Thank you guys for sharing your journey. Back to kind of the family aspect of this. So, Pierre, Morgan, we've heard you guys talk about plenty of times how you think about structuring your finances, and actually we're not sure why Pierre still owns shares. I'm not sure what that's about. I'm going to post a picture here with damning evidence of share ownership in a Rochard household. I'm not sure what that's about. But anyway, what steps do you guys take as a couple to kind of align on what your portfolio strategy should be? And what advice do you have for couples who perhaps may not be as fully aligned as you guys are on overall financial planning what steps they kind of take to get there? So things like, spending versus saving, housing, how much to spend on housing, cars, food, vacations, emergency expenses, estate planning, all that stuff, tax planning, paying back loans, kids, their activities, associated costs, all those things that, we can easily find ourselves spending loads and loads of money on. How do you get on the same page, and what advice do you have to get others on the same page?
Yeah, great question. So I think that to tie it into the chair's accusation, what you've got to align on is what is the utility, right, that you're getting from spending your money. Because I think that it's very easy in the fiat system to fall into this trap of saying, oh, it's an investment, right? Okay, so that's like the IMF position, is that buying a chair is an investment. Buying a house is an investment. Buying a boat buying a car is an investment. And so they say that all these things are investments, but really what they are durable consumer goods, right? So they depreciate over time. And in real terms, their value goes down. In nominal terms, due to fiat hyperinflation, sure, their price might go up. So you might be able to sell your used car for more than you bought it. But in real terms, the value of it went down. So I think that's a really important, subject to align on with your spouse, because otherwise you get into like, oh, is this collection of shoes an investment? Like, just, yeah. And obviously I'm talking about the man here, but that's one thing. And second, looking at your balance sheet as a whole, saying, hey, look, you don't look at your balance sheet just by looking at your financial assets, right? Your balance sheet also includes your car and your house. Even if those are not investments, they are on your balance sheet and they are part of your net worth. And so, if all of your net worth is tied up in your home equity or is tied up in your luxury car, that's something to evaluate, and that's something to think about, because it's not just the case that, oh, well, I use it to drive places and therefore it justifies spending an arbitrary amount of money or tying up capital in it. So being clear-eyed and objective about what your finances are does require you to do actual accounting. I think that one of the biggest problems with personal finance is that people do mental accounting. So they think that just in their head, they're going to be able to come up with their personal financial statement. And unfortunately, humans are not walking calculators. And so we can't do that. You've got to sit down with a spreadsheet and ideally perhaps with a financial planner who can be more objective than you to really take an inventory of what are your assets, what are your liabilities, what are your sources of income, and what are your expenses, and categorizing them all objectively and then looking at them objectively so that you're not doing this mental accounting where one day you feel rich because you got a windfall of income. And then the next day you feel poor because you got a tax bill. That's, that is really not going to lead to great outcomes for your personal finances. I'll let Morgan add to that.
Yeah, I love everything you said. So I definitely don't disagree with anything there. I think there are also just simple rules of thumb that you can follow as a family to help make the other numbers work. So for starters, in my practice, we do something called life planning. Life planning takes clients through the process of casting a really wide net of everything that's in their life, then narrowing that down and prioritizing what is important, and then knocking out any obstacles that might get in the way of what's important to that family and to that household. And when we go through this process, people say things like they want to have a home, but they don't say that they need to have a 7,000 square foot home, right? They don't need the highest luxury home. It's the feeling that you get at the home. It's the same thing with your cars and your boats. It's not about the car or the boat that you have or the closet full of shoes that you have. It's the feeling you get when you put on the nice shoes that you love. It's the feeling you get when your hair is blowing in the wind on the boat. So often what we do with clients is we come up with a way so that the client can experience that feeling without it, totally derailing their budget. So some of the ways where you can do that, right, would be to buy a smaller home, right? Right away, that's usually people's largest expense that they have on their income statement. And so if you're capping your home expenses to 20% or less of pre-tax income, you're going to be in a situation where you don't need to worry about the lattes you might want to buy or some random thing that you picked up at Target, right? You don't have to penny pinch as much if you haven't spent what the bank will allow you to spend, which is sometimes somewhere between 33% to 44% of income, depending on where you're applying for a loan. So these are just certain things to keep in mind where if you're keeping your large fixed expenses down, it'll afford you a lot more flexibility in other areas of your life. And so then what you can do is you can align your values as a couple on what it is that you want to spend your money in the other areas. And that way you're not breaking the budget in those other areas as well.
That is a really, really good answer to that. And I think it gives us all kind of some practical tips about how to consider planning for the future, how to do finances as a household. And I think even just the exercise of doing what you guys were suggesting to do will be a bonding activity, right? It kind of gets you closer as a couple and as someone who's, planning financial decisions, just the exercise.
Yeah, definitely. The exercise is totally worth it. And I would say that at a minimum, you need to be meeting quarterly about what's going on in your finances, especially if you're not working with a professional, right? A professional is going to keep you on track and make you check in at least twice a year about what's going on. And if you don't have a professional also keeping track of all the little details, right, then you need to be doing it at least quarterly, especially if it's not just you, especially if it's you and your spouse. And there's one person in the household who handles more of the finances than the other. So then what happens is that one person takes on that role. The other person is totally left in the dark. And when you are left in the dark on something, right, maybe you don't think it's a big deal because you're the person in the relationship who's handling all the finances. But imagine if it were the other way around and it was your spouse who was handling everything and keeping you in the dark. And they're not doing it on purpose, right? I think that that's sort of the other thing to point out here. It's like you've got lives, you've got kids, you've got jobs, you've got commitments and kids' activities and all sorts of other things that are important to you in your life. Maybe your finances aren't the most important thing, or maybe it's really important to you, but it's not the most exciting thing that you want to be doing. And so therefore, somebody who isn't doing it really does get kind of pushed aside in this scenario. And what I've seen over and over and over again is that spouse then not only feels left out, but feels totally inept. And if something were to happen to the spouse who is taking care of everything, they literally wouldn't know what to do, even if they were doing their own finances prior to being married. And you don't want to get yourself in that situation. And you definitely don't want to leave your spouse in that situation if something happens to you.
Can I ask a question on that? Just hearing you talk, I just feel like is the majority of your job really relationship management? And then the finance aspect just comes into it, because what you find is a lot of times that people just on different pages altogether, And like once you mend the relationship a little bit, like the finances actually go smoothly?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. So I would say that it definitely starts with relationship management for sure. There are other aspects though of people's financial plans where like we've seen it thousands and thousands of times. So it's no big deal for us to say, hey, do a Roth conversion, or hey, you have a little tax planning opportunity over here, or hey, did you consider XYZ thing or something about estate planning that would make sense for that person? Right. And that's where our expertise comes into play. But then yeah, I would say like at least half of my role is managing the relationship with the client, then also making sure that the spouses are communicating and doing everything that they need to do to get their finances to the place that they want it to be.
Oh, yeah, I love the discussion of planning and kind of family planning. Wanted to jump in with another question. So, unfortunately, we're governed by a predatory entity, and I'm wondering, if you see a lot of common mistakes that Bitcoiners make from a tax perspective, and what are some like easy ways that Bitcoiners or easy strategies that Bitcoiners can implement to kind of protect their stack from state predation?
Have a boating accident or something. No, just kidding. You didn't hear that from me. So yeah, I mean, I think there are trade-offs in all of these situations. So planners like me always like to talk about tax loss harvesting. So it's a really easy win where you can deduct $3,000 per year on your tax return, depending on the loss that you have. So for instance, if you had a $10,000 loss in your Bitcoin, right now there's a loophole in the tax code whereby you can sell your Bitcoin, buy it back immediately. You could take that $10,000 loss. They're looking to close that loophole. So it's more like a wash sale rule where you have to hold it for 30 days before you do something like that. But as of now, it's still open where you can do it. But you pay transaction fees for doing so, right? But you get to deduct this loss. So in the first year, if you took that $10,000 loss, you would deduct $3,000 on your return. In the next year, you would deduct another 3,000. If let's say in year 3 you had a gain, you can use the remaining $4,000 that you have as a loss carry forward to offset any gains that you took in that year. So that's how the loss harvesting works. So there's something nice about that, right? The government's sort of throwing, oh, we'll share your losses because we also share your gains type of a thing. But like they share in cat's losses, right? But in the meantime, right, you pay transaction fees. So what that literally means is that when you're doing tax loss harvesting, you're selling your stack and you're going to get back a slightly smaller stack in order to take this tax deduction. So the trade-off there is, do I want a smaller, like, is the deduction worth it me to to justify me having maybe a slightly smaller stack for doing, in which case you have to do the math on whether or not it makes sense. So there's certain things like that. I would say the same thing with like your 401k, right? There's a trade-off there. I would say it probably makes sense to get the match at the very least. If you're in a high tax bracket, maybe you do want to put more money into a 401k plan because the amount of deduction that you would get there would justify maybe the amount of tax savings that you would then have that you can go and put into Bitcoin. But again, you're probably putting your money into a place where you can't invest in Bitcoin. So if your whole goal is to be 100% in Bitcoin, then maybe that's not the right strategy for you. But if your goal is maybe, okay, I already own a lot of Bitcoin, I'm going to use this to diversify, then that would be a good way to save some money on taxes. Those two are like sort of the big ones that come to mind. There's definitely other opportunities. I would say those are case by case basis. So if you're thinking about your specific financial situation, you're not sure, I would absolutely reach out to a financial planner or a CPA to like see what tax planning opportunities are available to you.
Morgan, do you happen to know any financial advisors who happen to understand Bitcoin and are also really good financial planners? Just asking in case you know somebody.
Yeah. So obviously I provide the service and we mostly work with Bitcoiners. There's a small group of us on Twitter. So it's not just me. Andy Flattery is another planner who comes to mind. There's Isaiah Douglas as well, who does it. He works mostly with veterinarians. Jim Kreider also is a Bitcoin financial planner. Andy Edstrom has a practice and he also works over at Swan. There's Trent Dudenhofer is a CFP. He works for Bruce Fenton. They have a financial planning arm there as well. And David Aransky also comes to mind. He runs a practice much like mine that also does life planning. So there's a group of us. We're small. We are hopefully growing because I think that this is the future, right? I mean, to me, I don't think that there should only be 5 of us. I think that there should be thousands of us because this is where money is headed, and people are going to need good advice in regards to their Bitcoin, not necessarily in regards to their fiat assets. So my hope is that other people will join our small band of merry brothers here. But in the meantime, that's who's out there.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, it's a good start for people to get connected. Thank you for sharing that. We've talked a lot about individual financial planning. We've talked a lot about how to approach finances in general. We've talked a lot about how to plan finances together as a family. I want to switch gears a little bit more and talk about kids. Specifically, you guys have a young family. I would venture to guess that many listeners do as well. And it's harder than ever, even without Bitcoin, I think nowadays to raise, to raise kids in accordance to the Bitcoin ethos, even without the existence of Bitcoin. So how do you go about teaching your young kids about money, savings, just general responsibility in kind of the environments where we have a nanny state, general irresponsibility in society, etc.? How do you go about teaching your kids that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I like to tell my son that Bitcoin is our money and is the government's money, because that's really the truth, is that Bitcoin is decentralized and the dollar and other currencies are centralized. And so, it's really about empowerment and sovereignty. So that seems to connect with him. And we'll see about maybe a Bitcoin allowance a little bit later on. But right now he's just enjoying being a kid.
Yeah, I love that. I would add too that I think that parents expect their kid learn about money without teaching them really anything about responsibility. And those things go hand in hand. You can't expect your kid to all of a sudden be really good with money when you can't even get them to, like maybe put some silverware on the table and do other maybe small household chores. And, we're guilty of that too, right? We've got young kids and it's hard to get them to do things. But I think it's not just the chores, right? It's enabling them to be individuals, to be people who don't need you when they get older, right? The best job that you could do as a parent is that your kids go off and they live a happy, merry life and they're able to make all sorts of decisions on their own behalf without needing you. And I think it's really like easy to get caught up in the day to day of what's going on and forget to, teach your kid to tie their shoe until they're 12, and that parents are very guilty of sort of keeping kids young for as long as possible. And I love that too. Like I want to do that, right? I want my kids to be as young as they are for as long as possible. But I also recognize that at some point they need to be on their own. And that's the whole point of this. And that our job is really to guard them until they're ready to do that. And I think that all of that plays into how you teach them about money, right? If you teach them to be a responsible individual in general, then it's going to be a lot easier to teach them to be responsible with money, as opposed to if you just don't really teach them any of that and how to be self-sovereign and so forth, then adding the money piece onto it later is just going to complicate things.
Yeah, to kind of add on top of that too, that's great thoughts, Morgan. Made me think so much about Frida and my young two kids and how our son, who once he turned about 4 years old, started asking more questions about money. Not in the traditional sense of what is money, but more in the sense of, hey, this toy broke, buy me a new one type deal. And so those become opportunities for the parent to engage the kid in the ideas about money and not only teach the child about money, but to also challenge their own understanding about money and start growing themselves. And that's one of the reasons why we created the book Bitcoin for Kiddos, is because we wanted to create an open, easy, engageable book that parents could read to their children and begin the discussions about money and start growing in that philosophical mindset early, and to start talking about it early and often. And as we all know, the more times you do something, the more comfortable you'll become with it and the more easier it'll become into the future. So the earlier people can think about money in their own personal relationships and also begin talking about money with their children, the more everybody grows together and their understanding of money and what money can be used for to leverage what they want to get out of life becomes much more easily accessible.
Yeah, I love that. I would also add one more thing. Learning is a 4-step process. Somebody either teaches you about it or does it for you. Then somebody helps you do it side by side. Then somebody watches you do it. And then somebody lets you go and do it on your own. And so when you apply that in the context of money, right, to start, it's that you're talking to your child about like your values and what's important with money, right? Then you're doing it side by side with your child. You're helping them in a situation where maybe they need to use money and you're doing it together. Then letting them do it on their own, making a decision about money on their own, but you're still watching and supervising to help them make the right decision. And then lastly, you full faith and trust in them and you let them go off and do it on their own. And at that point, right, they're going to make mistakes and it's your job as a parent to help them learn from those mistakes and encourage them in that regard, rather than, chastising them and telling them that they did the wrong thing.
Yeah, and it's almost the same progression when you're teaching somebody how to use the Bitcoin network or the Lightning network, right? Because like with my wife and I started buying Bitcoin first, and then she ultimately said, "Okay, fine, buy it. I trust you." And then she was like, "Well, how does this work?" And I said, "Okay, well, why don't you buy some? Or why don't I show you how to buy some?" And then she stood over my shoulder while I made a transaction. And then at some point, I stood over her shoulder while she made a transaction. And now we both make transactions, and neither one of us has to worry about the other on whether or not we're going to mess something up, because we went kind of through that 4-step process as adults too, just like we would do for our children.
Yeah, this is kind of low time preference learning and child education and even adult education exemplified, right? It's taking the slow and measured approach to raising kids, to teaching anybody of any age how to do anything for the first time. And it takes patience. And we've become so accustomed, I think, as a society to things being done for us and for us to outsource all kinds of things, including education. And it's no wonder we don't have proper education in schools anymore, because we've kind of outsourced that responsibility to a group of people perhaps who are not at all incentivized to do things right and to do things the proper way. And it becomes just a myriad of shortcuts in all kinds of topics, not just money. But Pierre and Morgan, you guys brought up some really good points about how to go about instilling these values of responsibility in kids. And I think one of the kind of is it takes a village to raise a child. So let me ask you guys were in New York for a while, and then you moved to Austin. I would imagine this has to do with it, but is your kind of immediate community now, especially that you're kind of in Bitcoin land and in Texas and in Austin specifically, are they kind of immediate group, orange pilled? How do you manage dynamics of friends, family, especially when it comes to the low time preference methods that we talked about of raising kids? And how do you deal with kind of immediate friends and family and perhaps people who aren't orange pilled who are in your immediate group?
Yeah, I think one of the nice parts about living in Austin is there are lots of Bitcoiners here. So, when I think about our group of friends and all the play dates and the kids that they hang out with, it's a far greater percentage than you would get by randomly picking people off the street. So I think it's great to, find communities of Bitcoiners and, develop those and hang out and raise your kids together and, cook steaks together. I also think that there's lots of good people who are not Bitcoiners, and it's great to have normie friends as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we are in a great spot because we're close by to family. We have Bitcoiners all around, and we have a really loving, supporting community that we live in. And so I would say, I mean, it's just night and day difference between what we had in New York, where we were in a small apartment and we had a small dirt patch that we can play in, and the park was always extremely crowded, and there was always a line for the one swing our son always wanted, stuff like that, where you're ready to go. And when we got here, it's like, I mean, I feel like we live a country club life, and we don't even belong to one. So I encourage people to find a community where you see sunshine and you have some land that you can live on, and a community around you that you like and want to be around, because it's really worth it.
For sure, for sure. Thanks for your perspective on that. Let me ask you guys kind of one last question before we let you go. So you've been in Bitcoin as long as you guys have been. There's actually a meme going around now, which I don't even know if it makes sense. I don't know if I understand it. Basically, being in Bitcoin for 4 bear markets is what makes you a full Bitcoiner or something like that. But being in Bitcoin, I guess generally, and relatively long as you have been, what changes in your mindset? Do you think that Bitcoin gets somewhat boring kind of after the initial cycle of who does it become more matter of fact and more rational? It sounds like you guys are in that boat now. What changes, I guess, as you kind of progress in your understanding and knowledge and just general time spent in Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't get boring. I mean, I feel like every day something happens where I pull out the popcorn and just, have a good laugh. So not boring from an entertainment perspective. Also not boring from a technical perspective. Bitcoin's technology is still rapidly developing, and I can't keep up with all of the innovation happening on and around Bitcoin. So certainly not boring from that. Also not boring from a professional perspective. I mean, as you mentioned, I worked at Kraken for 3 years. We got onboarded onto the Lightning Network, and now for, more than a month, I've been at Riot as their VP of research. Just so much going on in terms of building there. The Riot is deploying miners and building at such a rapid pace. Highly encourage anyone who wants to reach out. I'm happy to see if we can do a visit, right? And to go take a look at the world's biggest mining facility together. So not boring from a professional perspective. I also, in terms of, does it become more rational? I mean, it does in the sense that I know more about the fundamentals of Bitcoin, the technicals of Bitcoin, but it also, increases your confidence in Bitcoin. And perhaps one could rephrase that as it increases your faith in Bitcoin, not to be accused of being religious about Bitcoin, but I really think that it does have tremendous religious elements to it. And that if you look at it through that lens, that, Bitcoin's immutability and our expectation of how long Bitcoin's going to last, like, I think Bitcoin is going to last longer than my own lifespan, right? I think that when I pass away in however many decades, not going to put that Bitcoin will still be doing exactly what it's been doing for the past decade. And that's just based on the software engineering and the economic incentives at play. So I think that as time goes on, my confidence and my faith in Bitcoin has grown. And that, that does mean that not only do I understand Bitcoin's fundamentals better, but some could accuse me of being a Bitcoin fundamentalist, right? That I have less and less patience for other things, whether it's in kind of the fiat clown world or in the hyper fiat crypto clown world. But that's definitely something I've felt over the past decade of being in Bitcoin.
Amazing. Morgan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would also add, I mean, I feel like the journey is just getting started. It feels so early, and I have more and more in-depth conversations with clients about Bitcoin. So it doesn't get boring to me. In fact, it gets more exciting. The more questions that people ask, the more it feels like it is going in the direction that we thought it was going to go. I would say, like, from my perspective, the thing that I find the least interesting is the price, because the price isn't relevant really to everything else that's going on, right? It's relevant in the regard of like how much adoption the market seems to think there is at this given period of time, but it's not really relevant to the day-to-day conversations that I'm having with people and how we're like positioning clients to not just have Bitcoin as part of their portfolio, but also, own their own have their own private keys, have their coins be off exchange, have them actually make Bitcoin transactions, right? It's all going in a direction where it's a money that people are going to use, which is the full intention of why we're putting this in somebody's portfolio. So for me, I think it's gotten more exciting, not less.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think money the US dollar price, let's call it, matters less and less to you as your understanding and your time in Bitcoin grows. Last thing for you guys is kind of we look to close out here. This is a bear market. Bear markets, as we know, are for building. And if you follow at Offender 2 yellow, it's also for fighting, but we won't ask you guys to fight or pick random fights with people. It's for building. So as you kind of speak to maybe the class of 2020, 2021, newcomers to Bitcoin, what do you think are the top 3 things they can do in this bear market to get better at, to strengthen their conviction, to learn how to do? We know, Pierre, you're a big fan of developing on Bitcoin and learning Python and definitely learning SQL. But what are the top 3 things that plebs from the class of 2020, 2021 can do during this bear market that you guys think about?
Yeah, I think first of all, have free cash flow, have income that exceeds your expenses. First of all, so that you can continue to hold. Second, so that you can set up a recurring buy and continue to accumulate. You don't want to be, lowering your average cost of your coins and just increasing your stack of sats. Second, as you mentioned, learning education. So, really go read more Bitcoin books. There's always, and focus on the books that are actually about Bitcoin's technicals, right? The underlying software engineering. Obviously, the economics are important, but maybe after you've read Saifedean, you're good to go on the economics, and you can deepen your knowledge of the software development. Go as a third, you might consider, if it aligns with your career goals, to find a career in a Bitcoin company. So coinerjobs.com. Riot is hiring as well. We're a Bitcoin only mining company that is publicly traded and growing. And so if you are looking for a role, definitely check out our careers pages, send a message on LinkedIn, happy to connect. And those would be my top 3.
Yeah, just a quick plug there as well. Coinbits is hiring too. Guys, check us out, coinbits.app, and we have our career listings on bitcoinerjobs.com and also on our careers page. So check out Coinbits. Sorry for the quick plug, more.
Yeah, actually, I want to add a number 4. Check out your local Bitcoin meetups and also, any conferences. I know that there's the Pacific Bitcoin Conference coming up that Morgan and I will be speaking at, and there's others as well. So I think that, finding that community and meeting in real life can be really valuable. Although, I know that there's a debate. There's a lot of fighting over whether you should buy Bitcoin or buy conference tickets. I think that you could probably, just sell some chairs and be able to afford both.
Yes, sell your chairs, buy Bitcoin conference tickets and Bitcoin. Morgan, what are your top 3 tips or 4?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a shameless plug for my book. I mean, there's no better time to do financial planning than during a bear market. So I have a personal finance book. It's called the Personal Finance Quick Start Guide. I highly recommend that you check it out. There is a section on Bitcoin in there, but majority of it is actually about just standard, boring, boilerplate financial planning. And it's not a quick start guide. That's actually the biggest downside is that I've heard it's a misnomer. It's actually a 350-page book. It's a very comprehensive book on what you can be doing with your personal financial situation. So I highly recommend checking that out. The second thing I would recommend is stop checking the price. The more you check the price, the more anxiety you're going to have, the less likely you're going to be able to hodl. There was a study done by Fidelity about which accounts did the best. And it was from accounts who actually the owner passed away and the next generation hadn't claimed the account yet. Those are the accounts that do the best. And it's because people aren't going in there trading, checking the price, doing all those things. So stop checking the price as much as you can. And the third thing I would say is if you haven't already done it, put your coins in cold storage. You're much less likely to trade it. Also, if you have it in cold storage, it's also in your best interest to not be holding these things on exchanges. So I would say no better time than a bear market to secure your coins.
Agree 1000%. So that's why at Coinbits, we encourage you guys to take custody of your own coins. Coinbits has multiple DCA products. We have savings habits. We have Roundup to allow you to kind of, as you make purchases, everyday purchases, grow your Bitcoin stack and kind of tax your high time preference spending. And perhaps you're buying replacement chairs for your office because your chairs are all ripped up. And the spare change from that purchase goes into buying Bitcoin once a week. So check out Coinbits.app. It's a really good way, and we think we've killed it on UX and customer support. Shout out to our customer support team is really awesome, and we can help guide you into how to withdraw your Bitcoin, how to transfer it to self custody, and yeah, definitely the time to be learning those things is now. And if you are in the central New Jersey area, check out NJ Bitcoin. On Twitter, it's at NJBTC. Check that out. It's a really cool way to kind of meet other Bitcoiners and learning from an immediate group of friends and family is a really good way to do it. We need people in meet space, so to speak. All our online friends on Twitter are really awesome. When push comes to shove, being local and being able to connect with people locally, there's no substitute for that. Pierre, Morgan, you guys have been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Morgan, I've added a link in this space to the tweet where you talk about your book. Check it out if you are listening to this for the first time and haven't seen it. So it's a really good book. I have it on order. I haven't actually received it yet, but Morgan, I'll definitely be sharing my feedback with you once that comes through. Pierre, Morgan, any kind of final thoughts? Any last minute shills or plugs you want to guide people to?
Go buy Morgan's book.
I was going to say, listen to our podcast. We have a podcast called Bitcoin for Advisors, and we try to put those out monthly. It's really good educational content, so feel free to check that out. And thanks so much for having us on. This has been real fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Amazing. Yes, thank you guys. Thank you for joining. And for people who are listening to us for the first time, do these weekly. So follow us on Twitter. Our schedule varies a bit week to week, but I think we found this nice time slot on Friday afternoon. So follow us. We try to bring you Bitcoin news, amazing speakers like Pierre and Morgan to talk about different topics. So give us a follow on Twitter, and we'd love to hear from you all soon. Thanks so much, Pierre and Morgan. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye, everybody.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Bitcoin Roundup podcast presented by Coinbits. So what do you think of the conversation? Share your thoughts with us on Twitter at CoinbitsApp, and be sure to subscribe to be notified of our next episode release. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Bitcoin Roundup podcast.